it's a conversation I think that we need to be having, right? Like
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
it's time. Building our community
at Circle Time,
learning from each other
at Circle Time. When we come together, there's no mountain we can't climb. Come join us for Circle Time.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Circle Time with the AECEO. My name is Rachel Neville. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm so excited that you're joining us again for another episode. Today, we have a returning special guest, Alana Powell, whose pronouns are she, her. Alana is the executive director of the Association of Early Childhood Educators, Ontario. And we were so lucky to have Alana chat with us for part one. And we had so much to talk about that now Alana's back for part two. So if you haven't heard part one, I highly recommend you go back and listen to it. And today we're going to be just diving deeper into some more details, a few listener questions. And yeah, can't wait to talk to you, Alana. Thanks for joining me again.
Thanks for having me back. I'm really happy to be here.
I want to just start with a question we got from our EC community based on kind of our last conversation, which is why can't the AECEO membership be free?
Oh, such a good question. We try so hard to be inclusive in our work. And I think we all really wish we lived in a world where the AECEO membership could be free. Because we do recognize, for early childhood educators, any additional expenses is challenging, right? And until we really get wages and working conditions that they deserve, it's always going to be difficult. And it is difficult for us to ask members for money and ask our community for donations. But it's really important because it's the only way that this organization will continue to exist and that this important work will continue to get done. So for folks, folks may not know, we're a registered charity, so we are a nonprofit organization, and membership revenue and donations is, it's a substantial part of what makes this organization function, right? We have staff, we have to pay staff. Advocacy can't happen without the folks who are organizing all the initiatives to engage educators across the province, and that takes a lot of time and resources, and it's a lot of invisible hidden work that I think isn't seen, and perhaps we don't show it as clearly as we could, how much time and work really goes into do the things that we do. So we're very lucky that we are supported by grant funding as well, and we have project work, but that's really not sustainable, right? It's like 2 to 3 year project cycles. We're always reapplying to get secure continued funding to make sure we can keep the work going. So membership revenue for us is really important, and it really holds transformative potential, I think, for what the AECEO could do in the future. And it certainly helps demonstrate the collective voice that we're trying to build, having a membership base.
Yeah, like you said, life is expensive these days, but we hope that makes people feel good about that contribution and like supporting the advocacy movement in Ontario. And that's so incredible to be a part of that.
Yeah. And I think about, like how amazing the care collectives are in creating those safe spaces for educators to come together, to talk about things that are important to them, to do it outside of their workplace, to do it with colleagues from across the province who they share values with. And that is only possible because we have staff to support it, right? And the staff who support
Yeah.
it, we need to fund that work. And so it is really important. And I think, in the past, when we've talked to members and we've said, what's the most important value of your membership? And they say advocacy. right? That
Yeah.
collective voice. And so it's not the same kind of return on investment that you might get from other memberships, right? It's something bigger, I think, that we're all contributing to by being members of the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. A quick note on care collectives. They were formerly called communities of practice, and we have a two-part episode coming soon, so stay tuned for that. So that kind of leads me into my next question for you, which is I'd love to talk more about the structure of the AECEO and what it means to be a membership-based organization. So you told folks that we were a registered charity, but in terms of being a member-based organization, how does that guide our work and what does that really mean?
As a membership-based organization, we are responsive to the needs of our members, and there are mechanisms by which members can inform the work of the organization. So, as members, we ask every year at the annual general members meeting for members to come, and we report to them transparently about the work that we've been doing over the last year. We do an annual report that outlines all our activities. We talk about our financial situations. We elect the board of directors that will govern the organization. We approve motions, and that's really where members get the opportunity to come and shape the work that we're doing and inform the work that we're doing. Like, let's say we win a wage scale for early childhood educators in Ontario. It's not just going to be AECEO members that benefit from that wage scale. But what members can do is shape the work that we're doing by participating and by sharing in these membership only opportunities like the AGM that we have every year or like membership check-ins. Hearing from members directly about what their experiences are, what their challenges are, can really help direct the work we do in a more reciprocal way and a more collaborative way, I think, as well throughout the year.
Yeah, well, that actually leads perfectly into our next question, which is why does membership matter? And if I were to become a member, what would I actually get for my membership? So you kind of already touched on being part of that advocacy collective voice for change. So what else could I expect as a member of the ACEO?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, Rachel, who, I'm looking at you right now, is working on some really exciting stuff for members that I think is going to transform this conversation even. So I almost feel like part of this answer is like, wait and see, members, there's more coming for you in the future.
Yes.
When we face a policy problem or there's new legislation or there's new regulations being introduced, the first place we go to check in to try and understand how should we be responding? Is this even something we're going to respond to? Involves connecting with members and putting their priorities first because they are the folks who are supporting this work. And so we are responsive to them. So, it's one thing to say membership is contributing to the, building our collective voice and our advocacy, and that is very important. But in terms of what a member gets back, it's really that opportunity for your voice to lead and to drive that policy work. And I think for educators, like there are so many decision-making spaces that they're left out of. That creating real opportunities for their voices to lead our work has been a priority for us. And so that, I think, from my perspective, that's one of the most important functions of membership. And from what we hear from members too, I think that that's also really important. But there's other stuff too, like we have Bel Air Direct, a program with Bel Air Direct to offer discounted insurance rates. We have a Percopolis account. We've got the ECE Link publication, which is exclusive to members with opportunities for them to share their stories in that publication and to use that resource.
Yeah. And since we're here, I just want to add a couple of things too. We have exclusive membership only podcast episodes, which will be coming out. And we recently launched our merch store, and members can get discount codes as well as exclusive member merch. We have lots of exciting new things coming in the new year in 2025. So it's never been a better time to become a member, in my opinion. I can't leave this question without also mentioning the community aspect of it. I think that that's something really unique about the AECEO is that we work really hard to provide spaces for people where they can meet like-minded people or they can think together about big ideas or challenges that they're having in their practice. We're always trying to find new and innovative ways to bring people together and to, build that ECE community, which I think we all really crave.
The community element is so important. And when I think about what becomes possible as, as membership grows and the voices involved in the movement grows, like it is about visioning what we want in 10 years, in 20 years, what's the future of early learning in childcare, and making sure that educators themselves are leading that conversation. I bet there will be something exciting for members going on in 2025. That's my guess.
It's a good guess.
Anymore, though. I'm not gonna say any more about it though.
So there's a lot of things that are tangible and intangible. And I think that that's one of the challenges we have of articulating what membership is, because we can give a big long list of all of the perks that we offer, but there's also this community advocacy, being a part of something bigger than yourself that is, it's hard to articulate. But I think once you join, you'll get the vibe.
Yeah, the feeling like you experience it when you find
Yeah.
it.
So when folks choose to become members, they pay us their membership fee, which we have a range of fees depending on whether you're a student or retired. We try to price as fairly as we can. And with that funding and with project funding, what does the AECEO materially do in the day-to-day? What is the scope of their work? Who is the target of advocacy? What does the strategy look like? Those kinds of things.
Yeah, great question. And not the easiest question to answer too, because the work is very diversified. We're doing lots of different things, but they are all working towards one main goal. So let's start with that, right? The work of the AECEO for the last 7 to 10 decade, let's say decade, like we're coming up on that. Time is flying. For the last decade has really been focused on building educator voices in the movement for decent work. So talking about decent work, professional pay, what does that mean? What does it look like? How do we get there in Ontario? We know it's the primary reason that folks leave the field. It's the primary concern when we talk to them. We know how valuable the work is. Like that's not up for debate, but how it's valued by government still is. So our work in the last decade has really shifted towards bringing early childhood educators into this movement. And for a number of reasons. When we think about advocacy, there's this kind of like traditional idea of advocacy that like when you have access to decision makers, you can convince them to do the right thing. And there may be times and places where that's effective, but that's not really how change happens. It really comes down to elected officials hearing from constituents that these are concerns that they need to be addressing. That's really what it comes down to. So I could go to the Ministry of Education and tell them every single day that early childhood educators need professional pay and decent work, and this is how we get there. And they don't have to listen to me. But when a constituent goes to their elected official and says, I'm only going to vote for you again if you move this forward. This is an issue in our community, and you're only going to have our support as a candidate if you address it. That's when we start to see real change happen. So our work has focused on like a diversified advocacy strategy that is about the Ontario government making policy and funding decisions that benefit early childhood educators and staff and children and families across Ontario. I feel like that's kind of the goal. That's the strategy. And the way we work toward that, I mean, it looks different every day. It looks different depending on the context, but the goal has been the same, and it's going to stay the same until we get there, because we still have lots of room to go.
Sometimes, Alana, you'll describe this to the staff team when we're trying to conceptualize it as like a big mountain. And what you just described is like our mountaintop goal. And then there's all these little like crevices along the way, along to the top of the mountain, which is our project work and the different strategies and tactics that we use to achieve that.
Where do we even start to like unpack this? Oh my goodness. But it's like, I mean, one big element of being able to do this work is about building community. It's about building that movement. And that's where the community organizing efforts come in, creating those care collectives, offering opportunities for educators to come together and talk about policy and start to understand how it impacts their lives, and understand too that their experiences as early childhood educators are so valuable to decision makers, and they really should be listened to. If you have a policy problem of like, we can't seem to retain early childhood educators, the best person to go talk to about why you're facing that policy problem is early childhood educators. So by doing these community organizing initiatives, like the care collectives, like storytelling training, like talking about policy, understanding why it's so important. And then there's other work, like sort of more government relations, which you might traditionally think about advocacy to be, which is like elected officials meeting with bureaucratic staff and policy people. And the policy solutions we are advancing are policy solutions that we develop collaboratively with early childhood educators and staff and folks across the province. And I think this is really important about the AECEO's work. We don't just sit in our home offices, right, and say, this is what we think is best for early childhood educators. We say, let's talk with some early childhood educators and figure out what's best here. We write program profiles and policy briefs. We have briefings with government. We do webinars to communicate information from briefings to our community. We do membership-only meetings. We do consultations. We do strategy sessions and leadership training and all this sort of stuff that contributes to these two important parts of our work, which is bringing the community together to build our collective voice. So we're advocating and doing that policy translation work so that those messages are moving between those working in the field to decision makers.
Yeah. Other things that I'm thinking about too are our communications work. We have an awesome comms person who tries their very best to translate everything we do in digital spaces.
Yes.
We have our amazing project coordinator who helps manage all the things. And I think perhaps folks sometimes underestimate what it takes to keep an organization like this running. Even though we are a small team, there's a lot of administrative tasks and financial things that need to be managed. So
those are like the behind the scenes mechanisms that we don't see. Okay, so we're going to put out a policy brief. Everybody has a role in the organization. The community organizers and the communications folks, like that's how we're hearing about what's going on in the sector, what are people talking about, what we're hearing on social media, people who are communicating to us, what are they saying, what's happening in the care collectives. All that information kind of comes in. And then we've got, the project coordinator who's like keeping us on track and like setting up meetings and getting sector stakeholders together, right? And like facilitating like the functions of the organization. And so it's sort of like all hands on deck when certain things like that happen. And then there's a story to tell too. Like if we just create policy recommendations and hand them over to government, they do one thing, but they don't come back to the sector and say, like, this is how we listened to you. What do you think about this? And tell the story of the work that we're doing. So I think there's there's just so many moving parts that happen behind the scenes that, maybe we don't make as visible as we could in sharing about the work.
I think you're making a great point around how something as simple as a publication or an Instagram post is informed by everyone on our team and the work that they are focused on. It's just hyper collaborative in the most beautiful sense.
It is beautiful, beautiful. Absolutely.
Okay, we have a few other questions that were sort of prompted by our listeners and our community. So, first of all, why does the AECEO say that we advocate for a public and nonprofit childcare system? And maybe you can also just kind of define that for folks, what that
Yeah.
is.
When we talk about, I think, the childcare sector right now, in particular with the, $10 a day program from the federal government, is that we think the only way we're going to achieve decent work and professional pay for early childhood educators and staff is through a publicly funded system.
Hmm.
And that's for a number of reasons. The market model that we've had, where sort of, childcare is funded through a mix of some government subsidies, but mostly parent fees and privately managed, whether it's, for profits or nonprofit programs, childcare programs open when and where they can, and they run as best they can. That hasn't solved issues of professional pay and decent work, right? And it's not going
Right.
to. But a
Hmm.
publicly funded system does a number of things that previous approach, that previous market approach doesn't do. One, it involves additional public funding, which is very helpful, as we can see with the fee reduction, right? If you want to make things more affordable, you need public funding to do it. If we want to see wages go up, we need more public funding to do it because parents can't pay for that, nor should they have to,
Hmm.
right? We
Hmm.
don't expect parents to pay for teachers' salaries, and we should not expect parents to pay for educators' salaries. A system also allows for a different type of kind of collective power for
Hmm.
the workforce, where right now, if an educator wants to negotiate their wage or, wants to see benefits introduced in their program, they may have the support of a union if they're in a unionized center to do that negotiation in a formal way and a legal way, or they may not. And if they don't, there's no recourse. There's no appropriate bargaining mechanism. They don't have a lot of power to go to their employer and say, this is what we need in order to be able to do our job well. And their employer might not have the resources to deliver on that, even if they wanted to.
Hmm.
But a publicly funded system allows us to see where decisions are being made about how funding is delivered and what are the conditions of that funding that shape the experiences educators are having, whether it's their salary, access to benefits, paid planning time, resources and materials. Like all of those things are defined by the policy and funding decisions that shape it. And a publicly funded system allows us to enhance the money that's flowing in and also better shape the conditions that they're experiencing because we have sources of decision making and there's transparency and accountability around them.
So that kind of touches on the public aspect. And what about the nonprofit piece there? Like,
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question. And, there's sort of decades of research that we could talk about, but let's talk about it as like a principle for a moment here of like what
hmm.
kind of system we want for early childhood educators to be working in and for children and families and communities. But at the end of the day, what we see happen in nonprofit programs is that the majority of the funding goes directly back into the program. It goes into higher staff wages, more resources for the program. Whereas, let's say you have a commercial childcare program, you may have some of that funding going to shareholders, which is it's a different approach, right? And the priorities then of decision making can be different because you have different stakeholder interests. So we really believe that in order for early childhood educators to be best supported, we need the priority of funding coming into the system to be going back into programs and back into supporting the well-being of educators.
Yes. As the AECEO, we will always advocate for ECEs no matter where they work.
Yeah, and like let's be clear about our policy position too, because our position is that we want a publicly funded nonprofit system to expand. We are not advocating for childcare programs to be closed. We're not advocating for childcare programs to lose their funding. We support early childhood educators no matter where they are, and we understand that there are community programs who've been serving children and families for decades, and we're not asking for them to be shut down. But we do believe the future of the system is one that should be publicly funded and publicly managed. And that's very important.
And there's also this very like material lived experience of like better program materials, paid planning time, benefits and sick days, higher wages, which are all things that people working in nonprofit childcare centers experience typically. Obviously,
Yeah.
there are exceptions to that, but when we're thinking about policy, we're thinking about, broad strokes here. So that's why I kind of invoke that example.
Yeah,
Um,
and like there's decades of research supporting that nonprofit centers tend to have better pay, better working
yeah.
conditions, all of those things. And it's because those additional funds are being redirected back into the program. And when we're
Yeah.
talking about public funds, taxpayer dollars, where do we want taxpayer dollars going? To make sure that educators are well compensated and well supported in their workplaces so that children are having the best experiences they can in those programs.
Yeah.
And that's responsible.
Yeah, absolutely. So another listener question that we had was, why does our work at the AECEO sometimes focus on childcare rather than talking about other places where ECEs work, for example, like in the school board?
Yes, this is such a good question. So, as a professional association, like our work is about early childhood educators, no matter where they work. And there's, many times we've done things that are specific for folks in kindergarten, like the kindergarten roundtable. We had a kindergarten working group and developed some distinct resources for kindergarten ECEs. And sometimes we're supporting educators in early on. So it is about being responsive to the entire profession. But right now, we have this really unique opportunity because of the new federal investment in the $10 a day system to see some advances for the profession, in particular for those working in these programs that are funded through the agreement with the federal government. There's additional money flowing through these, there's new requirements for the province to deliver on certain things. So it's a really big opportunity for us to gain some progress for early childhood educators that then becomes leverage for other early childhood educators. So let's say we win a wage grid in Ontario and the wage grid starts over $30 an hour. That gives bargaining power to early childhood educators in kindergarten programs to start negotiating with those wage rates in mind. So the idea here is that a rising tide does lift all boats. When we saw early childhood educators move into the school system and they were experiencing higher wages, albeit of course there's still challenges in the
Yeah.
kindergarten, but they were experiencing higher by the hour wages than early childhood educators in licensed childcare. That
Mhm.
helped to create the wage enhancement grant to address the lower wages in childcare. So we can see how when we win a bit here, we can leverage that to win something else here.
Mhm.
Not the best, most comprehensive approach, but we're working in a fragmented system, right? Early childhood
Yeah.
educators are working in publicly funded system, in private childcare, in early ons, in a variety of different jurisdictions that have different systems.
Mhm.
So as the association, we can think strategically about where do we have the most potential for growth right now? Where can we get the best policy wins that will impact the lived experience of so many early childhood educators and help us then give leverage and power to other early childhood educators, and we can support them to do that. So I think that's why we hear a lot more about childcare right now in our work, because there's strategic opportunity there for us to get some gains that will benefit everyone.
Mhm. Yeah, that's so well put. We're never picking favorites. We love all
Never.
ECEs equally, but you're
Yeah.
right, there's a lot of thought and intention around, like you said, this strategic approach. And again, in a perfect world, we would have enough time and resources and energy to advocate for every single ECE, but sometimes this is the approach that we have to take
For
and
sure.
hope that it'll all come around and benefit everyone.
Yeah. And I mean, like, part of, I think, our vision is that, like, we want to facilitate that. Yeah, that's something we want to continue to do. And we do work really positively with unions who represent early childhood educators in school boards. So it's about making sure our resources are going to the right place at the right time based on the political context we're in, and that we're working really collaboratively with partners to make sure that educators across the province will benefit.
Okay, our final listener question was, what does the AECEO's policy and government relations look like? For example, our funding formula.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the funding formula is a really good example of how our policy and government relations work keeps early childhood educators centered in a way that's really important right now. So just maybe a short bit of context. So at the end of the summer, 2024, the Ontario government released a new cost-based funding approach for childcare programs that were enrolled in the 10-a-day plan. And this funding approach changed the way that childcare programs would be funded. So as the Association of ECEs, it's really important that we sit down and look at this new funding approach and ask some really important questions about it. How is this going to impact ECEs? Does this do good things? Are there opportunities here that we can utilize to help get higher wages in childcare programs, or make sure early childhood educators are getting professional learning time as part of their paid hours during the workday? Like, what does this funding formula mean? What does it do? And how is it going to impact ECEs across the province? Does it reflect our policy position, sort of what we've asked of government, or not? Are the needs of early childhood educators going to be met by this? First we'll sit down, we'll do an analysis of it, we'll have some questions, and then, and in the case of the funding formula, recently we did meet with the Ministry of Education to get a technical briefing so we could ask some of these questions directly to them. Well, there's no wage grid in this funding formula. Why not?
Yeah.
How are we going to see higher wages without a wage grid? Based on what we hear from the ministry and our concerns or our questions about it, we'll come back to community and we'll talk about that together. So we'll have a webinar or a session to talk about what we learned, to talk about what our questions still are, to hear more from the community. What does this look like at the program level? Is there anything we need to be worried about? And we'll take those questions and we'll go and we'll meet with the Ministry of Education and sit down with the people who wrote the funding formula or government officials. And they'll walk us through some of the technical details, and we'll be able to ask questions and understand it better. Make sure that if we're raising red flags about it, or if we have criticisms about it, that those are valid. And if there's ways that creates opportunities that will benefit educators, that we can bring that information back and make sure we're providing resources.
So that would be like the process for a piece of legislation or policy that came out. Are there ever opportunities where we're consulted before something is published, or we have an opportunity to be part of that creation of that piece of policy?
To the level to which we're consulted and listened to varies depending on the priorities of the government of the day. So there have been times where the AECEO has been brought in to consult, for example, maybe about 10 years ago, on a workforce strategy. And our policy recommendations were adopted by government and were published in the workforce strategy, and there were commitments to enact them. Then there was an election and the government changed and that document went away. So sometimes we're consulted and in a really meaningful way, and our policies are adopted. And sometimes we're consulted and we're able to at least bring the concerns and the needs of the workforce directly to those decision makers, make sure they're hearing about it. Sometimes, what we're advocating for is not adopted by government.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of nuance, and there are limitations to what we can achieve, but we have had wins and we will continue to have wins. And even when we don't have those wins, bringing the voices of ECEs into those spaces where they are not often heard is still a win, even if we don't get the policy that we maybe are hoping for.
Yeah, this goes back to sort of what we were talking about earlier. Me going into a room to sit with someone from the Ministry of Education is not always going to be as effective as 20,000 early childhood educators across the province talking to their elected officials. It's actually early childhood educators and families and voters who have a lot of power. Uh,
Yeah.
we know this time and time again. We did this work with Olivia Chow years ago on how change can occur through this community organizing and the power of stories and storytelling. Part of what's often missed about our work is that if I go into an office and tell a government official that they need to implement a wage grid, they might think that that's a policy approach, but there's a number of policy approach on the table. But if other elected officials are hearing from early childhood educators across the province that they're not going to work in licensed childcare without a wage grid, or they're not going to work in full day kindergarten without paid planning time, or if those stories are coming from the community, it moves our agenda forward in a really meaningful way. But I mean, like, there is, even in times that are difficult, and I think right now is a time that has been very difficult ever since the COVID pandemic. It's felt really, really difficult, and we haven't seen as much progress as we would like to. But a lot of the work we've done has made a difference. We've seen enhancements to the wage floor and all that sort of stuff. But it's also about protecting what we've won, not losing any ground. And sometimes change happens in really fragmented timelines too. So a lot of work can be happening right now where we're building a lot of momentum and we're seeing things shift. Like, I got to meet with the Prime Minister a week ago to talk about early learning and childcare, working conditions that early childhood educators are experiencing in their programs, and how much that matters for building a quality system. That's a conversation that happened because of the momentum that our movement has been building. When the opportunity comes, we can be really effective and get the progress we need, get the change we need.
Yeah, I love that. It's inspiring. I
Is
think
that
that, if you're listening to this podcast episode and you feel lost or frustrated or uncertain, I hope that you'll join us and become a member and support the work that we're doing, because we need your voice and we need you to be a
yeah,
part of this movement and to help us continue building this momentum so that no matter how fragmented the timeline, we
yeah.
will get there, right?
I really believe we can get there. It really matters that early childhood educators are listened to.
Oh, thanks so much, Alana, for joining me again. It was so great to talk more about the organization and your work and how folks can get involved. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider becoming a member. The link to join us will be in the episode description, as well as the link to our brand new merch store. Your membership makes a difference in the lives of ECEs and childcare workers, children and families, and allows us to continue doing this amazing work that Alana spoke to today. To all the members who are currently supporting us, thank you so much. To all the ECEs and childcare workers listening, you are absolutely incredible, and you are the reason we do all of what we do.
Blobbity blob, blobbity blah.